Human-centered leadership isn't about being the most extroverted person in the room, or about pep talks, big energy, or being the loudest voice at the table. It's about being real. And today's guest, Karen Lam, embodies that really well. Early in her career, Karen was very much like the Nate Shelley of her organization. Quiet, reserved, deeply competent, a subject matter expert, an incredible individual contributor. And then she got promoted into leadership position. Suddenly, the feedback started coming in. Be louder, be more visible, bring more energy. Basically, stop being you and be more like Ted Lasso. So she tried. She turned up the volume, she overcorrected or overcompensated, forced herself into a leadership style that didn't really fit. And instead of building trust, it created friction. Now, if you have watched Ted Lasso, this should sound pretty familiar. It's the same trap that leads Nate down this villain arc and Roy exploding instead of connecting. What changed for Karen was a really powerful realization. She didn't need to lead like Ted. She could lead more like Coach Beard, quiet, observant, strategically, or like Roy at his best, intense, people first, powerful without being performative. Her leadership shows up in deep one-on-one conversations, in context, and listening first. It's human-centered leadership that doesn't announce itself with a big whistle or a big bang, and it still transforms teams. So in this conversation, we're breaking down the myth that great leaders have to be extroverts. We're talking about how some environments reward certain personalities and suppress others. And we're asking a question that might make some HR professionals a little uncomfortable. What if we've been promoting leaders based on personality instead of actual leadership skills? Now, remember, there are spoilers because we are talking about the Ted Lasso show and its characters. So if you haven't watched the show, pause now, go watch it, and then come back. And if you have watched it, grab your tea and your biscuits, and let's talk about what it really means to give and receive actionable feedback, to bring the right leadership skills, and especially how to lead with authenticity. This is Big Boss Biscuits. I'm your host, Kirsten Penalosa, and I'm excited to welcome Karen Lam. Hello, Karen. I am excited to have you here with me.
Yeah, for sure. I'm currently the director of customer support at Top Hat. But ultimately, the reason I'm here today is really to talk a lot about, introverted leadership styles, because that certainly resonates with me. And, having this podcast being about, well, really Ted Lasso and the whole leadership paradigm and human-centered, enablement and support that really spoke to me. So I wanted an opportunity to have a conversation.
I love it, especially because a lot of people focus on Ted Lasso as a character, as a very extroverted, very bubbly, spirited, lively leader. And we forget about the other leaders that are on the show that are equally amazing and impactful characters. So from your perspective, which leadership style or character does actually resonate more with you?
You know, Kirsten, that's a tough one because I feel like in different elements of my career, I resonated with different members within Ted Lasso. So I would say like very early on, even before I made the jump into leadership, I really resonated with Nate. I remember the first few episodes I watched and I pointed out to my husband, it's like, you know what? This character really speaks to me. It just feels so much like me and how I was growing into the role. So just to give a bit of context, I didn't start off in support. Technically, I started off in customer success. So I was an account manager. And in many of my roles, when I took on the opportunity, I spent a lot of time learning about the product, learning about the ins and outs, not only of the role, but what I was supporting as well. And I felt like when I was watching Nate, he was very much, like the expert on the team. He knew all the players, what the nuances were, what the expectations were, all the little pieces. And that just felt like what I was doing as well very early on in my career. So yeah, I mean, Nate, for the most part, really spoke to me. I mean, of course, Nate also goes through a transformation. That in itself is beautiful, but also terrifying. Just in terms of how his character developed. I wouldn't say that my journey was exactly like his there, but I did find when I started moving into leadership, one of the very interesting things, like in companies, is that when you can perform your current role really well, it just feels like the natural next step happens to be within leadership. And this is very common, especially with, small companies, smaller organizations that are trying to retain their talent, but also give them a growth path as well. And I think where many of us tend to fail, and where I struggled for a long time, actually, was really getting the support I needed in order to really flourish in leadership. And it wasn't that I didn't have any natural abilities. I mean, we can see with Nate, as he did transform at the very end, there was that natural leadership capability, but it's the environment and the support that you get. And especially based off of what energy you bring into work really depends on how, that comes back to you tenfold.
I call it a leadership mistake 101. You have an amazing individual contributor, and they do their job amazingly well. They're like the Nates in the world. They know the in and out of the product or the company, the history, the culture. They know the challenges. They really can put together the whole puzzle. And suddenly there's growth, and we need more people, we need more leaders, and we promote the best performing individual contributor. But then what? Without guiding and coaching and mentoring that one, we fail. I certainly failed in my first leadership role after being promoted from an individual contributor position because I didn't have that guideline. Or we get handed a leadership playbook of now be this. And you suddenly have to be maybe someone who you're not. And I think that's also where Ted eventually failed Nate. He first sees him as this amazing contributor, a strategic thinker and team member. He elevates him to be in a higher position, but then leaves all the feedback and all the coaching out. And that's where Nate kind of goes sideways and has a very different transition that we probably would have hoped for him. So what happened to you? Like you were an amazing individual contributor, you got promoted into leadership, then what happened?
Wow. So a lot of it, I would say, because I had to essentially coach myself. I did spend a lot of time reading, finding resources, trying to put individual pieces into practice. I would say my team performed very well. So in terms of an outcomes perspective, everything was going fantastic. But whenever there was a performance review, the feedback I would often get is, well, you need to be more vocal. You need to give more energy. You need to, well, be more strategic. And that type of feedback really confused me. And that's really confounding, especially for anybody, whether they're new or even experienced in the leadership role. That becomes incredibly challenging to work with because there isn't really any examples and it didn't really make any sense. So funny enough, instead of digging further and asking what the feedback really meant, I then took that and was like, okay, well, you're telling me I need to change up things. So then I started to really expend a lot of my energy. So being an introvert, the energy is usually turned inwards. It's not that I can't have what we would call extroverted qualities, but then I just essentially forced it on myself. Uh, what ended up happening was I was using up a lot of energy. So that meant that I was starting to feel burnt out. I was speaking more often, but honestly, if I were to compare myself with a character on Ted Lasso, it would be like every time Roy made an outburst. Ultimately, like the conversations I was having, the relationships cross functionally weren't improving. If anything, they were getting worse. So at that point, I did also get other feedback and I was like, wow, this is super confusing. What am I supposed to do? So then I just did full stop. I have to take a step back, go back to what I know, take in feedback and keep things within my control. And so at that point, after taking a step back, it did take a while to get to that point, but having that reflective moment, going back to what energizes me, made it so much easier in terms of having the right outcomes. Because ultimately, when I think about leadership, I think about very much similar to Ted Lasso, spending time with your team, having those empathetic one-on-one conversations. That part was still happening even when I was trying to be what I thought was being extroverted. But the problem I was having was that everything else within my performance, how my department, how my relationships were cross functionally, those were suffering. So I wanted to make sure that everything at that point, like we're, moving full circle, focusing on the things that matters. Because when I think about introverted leadership, part of the challenge, especially early in your career, is building that level of confidence. I mean, when we think about Nate, he was not very confident at the very beginning. He started getting a lot more encouragement from Ted, a lot more, kudos, and was really celebrated for his ideas. And, the part that we forget about is that leaders also need positive reinforcement, especially early on in your career, to know that you're going on the right path. So the crux of what I'm saying is definitely spending time with people is important. Port is really important in terms of supporting your people, supporting your leaders, providing the foundations that work, but also giving valuable feedback that is actionable and nothing fuzzy, because at the end of the day, that feedback that's provided can be incredibly difficult to understand and often misinterpreted.
That could be a complete different episode on feedback, giving feedback, receiving feedback. I have spoken publicly about that too. And it sounds like the feedback that you've gotten was not actionable because it was more about your personality.
Yes.
And I've seen that kind of feedback given very often to women. So I wonder if there is a double standard to explore there. And we see it with Rebecca in the show. Even with Keely, we have two amazing, powerful women that are being held to completely different standards than guys. So the Jamies in the world can get away with their behavior on television and their past, while Keely was heavily criticized for who she was when certain videos came out. Same with Rebecca. She is powerful and smart. She is a really good businesswoman and she is beautiful, right? In that order. However, everybody makes it about her age, her looks, and so on and so on. So then we hear this: you have a leader, a female leader in a position, and suddenly the thing is about be more vocal, be more this, but nothing about we need you to be more data oriented or we need you to deliver more this, like actionable feedback. So what do you think? Could there be maybe a double standard there?
I think there could be some of that. The reason I say that is because at Top Hat, I actually lead our Women in Tech employee resource group. And everyone at Top Hat is really wonderful, but also this community provides an outlet for those who need, to think about how they're being recognized, what is moving them forward, and how we can propel, our achievements forward. When we think about the feedback we receive as women, often it is about how we present ourselves. But the way I see it is, if I take away the introverted style, if I take away the fact that I am admittedly shy in terms of my personality, so I'm a little more quieter by default, which again feeds into the stereotype, but I'm also a person of color, and that also feeds into the stereotype of being quiet, reserved. So perhaps there is some of that in the feedback that's being received, across like anybody who identifies very similarly to myself. But the way to move past it is often when there's a misrepresentation of what you bring to the table, you need to revert that. And to revert that, fall back to what brings you comfort. Because when you have that confidence, you can walk into that room, even as a quiet person, even as a person of color, even as a female, and you can walk into that room armed with whether it's data, because you need to be more strategy driven, whether it's adjusting some of your language. So you're speaking more, like depending on your audience, speaking with a more executive tone, or staying away from certain words that might diminish the way you appear in the room. Now, men may not necessarily have those same challenges, but ultimately we all can learn from the same thing. Everyone who can move into the room with confidence can come with data and can come speaking in a way that is applicable to your audience. Those three individual pieces are enough for you as an individual to then start being seen as, valuable, and really can bring those ideas forward into the conversation. The issue we have is if we don't come in with those three individual pieces aligned, then it's very easy for those ideas to be dismissed. And it's not because you as an individual are not valuable. It's because the way you are bringing yourself into the conversation doesn't present itself as valuable. And I think that's the biggest drive or the biggest difference. It's less about thinking about gender differences, but more about thinking about how every gender can actually be rewarded if we focus on some of the similar things and the similar types of feedback that we expect when we bring, leaders into the conversation.
True. And those are skills that can be learned, that
Hmm.
can be developed. And it's definitely not gender specific. Like leadership is not a gender specific role.
Definitely. Mhm.
It's not. It's something that we can learn and we can develop. And so, how do we come out of that feedback conversation and have an understanding of how do I remain authentic? Because to be an effective and efficient leader, you have to be authentic. I don't think there's a leader who can be successful by faking it. So, how did you navigate that feedback and how did you get to that moment of this is who I am and I'm good with this?
Yeah, no, that's a challenging thing to think through, mostly because, well, one, it was some time ago. But having said that, though, when you receive feedback that is about your personality and isn't about presenting your authentic self, the important thing is to really, again, take that step back to really assess, like, what is that feedback truly, truly about? So, what ended up happening was a big shift because I didn't understand the feedback and I over calibrated on what I needed to work on. What I ended up doing was spending more time with my team because I think one of the big powerful things about being a leader, regardless of whether it's introversion or extroversion, is really having some of those deep conversations with your direct reports to really understand them, not only as an individual, but also what they bring to the team, where their strengths are. I do remember one conversation where I was talking with one of my team members. They had changed 2 or 3 different roles within the company before they came to my team. And again, about 6 months in, they were ready to move somewhere else. But what I realized was no one actually sat down and really had a deep conversation on what they wanted out of their career. They were a high performer, regardless of which role they were in, but no one spent the time to sit down with them to really, dig out and figure out what they were truly interested in. So at that point, we sat down, we started making tables and charts and like working with a lot of data, having a lot of conversations. And then the employees just started crying and that caught me off guard. But what was really interesting at that point was the moment was like, nobody actually did this for me before. I had no idea. And I think as leaders, especially when you think from a human centered perspective, we really need to do what is best for the individual, not only what is best for the company, but also best for the individual. And I think when we think about leadership and when I thought about the feedback, going back to my roots, going back to thinking through and having those deeper conversations ends up being really rewarding in the end.
The human centered part of leadership is one of the most rewarding aspects, in my opinion. And frankly, quite often, why someone should be in a leadership position, not because of power, not because of a higher paycheck. These are amazing perks, right? But truly, for me, the reason to be in a leadership position is because I get to have those one on one conversations. I get to develop the people that I have the privilege to lead. So, this is a really beautiful example that you have. You mentioned earlier with your peers when you started to overcompensate and you started to force yourself to have certain traits that you just naturally don't have. The one on one conversations were okay, but the conversations and the relationship with your peers weren't. So, what happened there and how do you recover from that?
Yeah, so that took a lot of, again, one on one conversations, individually speaking with each group. So in this particular example, yes, spending much more time with individual leaders, again, building that rapport, getting that understanding, because often I would say when we have a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation of somebody, we need to recalibrate. We need to take that step back, take that moment to understand the other person on the other end. Once that started happening, and the conversations were much more, I would say, peaceful and meaningful, then the relationships cross functionally began to get a lot better. The other piece as well, I mean, definitely as I've grown in my career and switched roles over time, what has really made the big difference in terms of encouraging the right relationships across departments is really that empathy piece. So, one of the things that I find incredibly important is for other departments to understand, well, really how our customers operate. And because when we understand how our customers operate, that also means that we understand how our support team operates. So, building that empathy across the entire organization is a big part of what I think makes leadership incredibly valuable. And also, especially today in companies that do promote remote work, that becomes even more so important. Also, even in the age of AI, when we think about human centered, we also need to focus on, empathy and understanding, because that actually helps move us faster. Even though, I think traditionally that is something that was seen as holding us back.
And then when you think about the rapport building, I feel like that's another almost underrated leadership skill. Now, you just mentioned you started to build rapport with your peers and you started to actually understand each other, and empathy is part of that. I do believe, though, that there are still certain leaders out there that believe rapport building is a waste of time. I read this really good book, the Coaching Habit. In that, he suggests a certain set of questions to ask in your one-on-ones to have really amazing coaching conversations. One of the first things he says is just cut to the chase, cut out the fluff. Don't talk much around things. And I actually heavily disagree with it. I agree with a lot of the other things in his book, but that part, I'm like, no, I will never stop going deep with my direct reports and anyone who lets me, right? And you see that with Ted. Ted immediately offers biscuits to Rebecca, and Rebecca's like, oh, no, no, we don't have to have this conversation. We don't have to have this biscuits with the boss moment, right? And he insists and he goes and goes. And eventually it pays out. They have such a strong bond that eventually she does open up to him and confesses everything, the sabotaging and all the scheme that she had going on. Because they had such a rapport by that point, he actually forgives her. And I think that's why I believe that rapport building is such a powerful skill to have and a powerful tool for when things get hairy, for when there is conflict. What can you tell about that phase of rebuilding the relationship and the rapport?
Yeah, it's interesting because even if we're looking at how rapport building was done in a fictional setting, a lot of it is spending that time and energy to get to know the other person. But you did hit the nail on the head realistically. Like as humans, one of our main areas of fear is to be misunderstood. We do not want to be misunderstood. And as soon as somebody understands us, that is ultimately a relationship for life. So I can definitely see why, Ted pushed so hard to understand Rebecca because he knew the value of relationship building. And for me, like rebuilding relationships cross functionally is incredibly important, but a lot of that is putting in the time and the effort to do that. I will say that different personality styles do mean that sometimes it takes longer to build that rapport. And there's some personality styles that, you sit down with them once and you're like, friends for life, but you don't actually have to be friends. Like that's the most important part I want to bring forward. When you're building rapport with someone, it's really just about shared understanding and finding that shared goal. So if we are only focused from a work perspective and not really focused on anything else personal, finding that shared goal between departments is how, we can move faster. And often because naturally coming from a background of support, I am helpful to a fault. But having said that though, often what I come forward with in these meetings, what else can I help you with? And usually at the beginning, whoever I'm meeting with, it's like, oh, no, we're good. Nothing needed. But I do find over time, there's then questions. It's like, oh, well, can your team help with this? We want to learn more about the customer here. Is that something you'd be able to help with? And again, the important part is when you build that rapport, it means having shared goals, shared understanding. And if you get a friend in the end, that's just bonus.
Right? Do you think there's something that organizations still can learn, especially on the HR side? Because hearing you speak through the impact of rapport building and that shared understanding, the shared goals, I still see so many companies struggle with silos, with departments not talking to each other, cross functional collaboration. And I always look to the leaders, not only of the departments, but also the leaders above. And I look to HR and the culture that they are enabling.
So I would say that Regardless of where we are in our career, there's always room for improvement. And definitely as an entire organization, not just with, HR or the people team, every single person has something to bring forward into that culture. If we think about the behaviors that we celebrate, if we celebrate the ones that are, about rapport building, about community, about coming together, cross functioning at different departments, if we celebrate those particular behaviors, then those are the behaviors we will see repeated in the organization. If we continue to focus on the less favorable characteristics, if that is what is being rewarded, then we're going to see more of that repeated in company culture. So yeah, definitely rapport building, empathy building, incredibly important. I think the other piece as well is leadership development. The difficult part is that when we think about personal development as a whole, it's something that's very inward. It's something that requires the individual to pull in, do an assessment, think through where there might be improvements that need to be made, and then perform that outward. The problem we see with feedback specifically when we provide feedback to individuals is what is primarily outwardly presented. So that's why in general, it's very difficult for an individual, especially a new leader, to understand what is provided to them. So I would love to see more companies focus on how we give feedback, not how you can, making sure the feedback you are providing is actionable and realistic.
When you think about the time that you got that tougher feedback or not actionable feedback, what would you have liked to hear instead?
When I think about situational and behavior and impact, so SBI, that particular acronym, if I was given a more explicit example of where I didn't, you know, come forward and was vocal and had that example to work with and thought through, okay, well, maybe they're not actually saying that I need to be louder and need to be more extroverted, but that maybe in this conversation, in this specific scenario, I did not advocate for my team. I did not come with data or the appropriate language to say, well, we are understaffed or having the appropriate information to come into that conversation. If I was given that feedback in that actionable and direct way, we would have a different conversation today, Kirsten. And I also think my growth path would have been much different. We often struggle because we try to move quickly. I think ultimately that is the big challenge. We try to move quickly. And sometimes we need to, but we also need to slow down, especially when it means to think about the careers of the individuals that we work closely with. We need to slow down in order to be intentional about the feedback that we bring forward. And I think that's really the big learning here.
Yeah. Do you have a specific feedback format that you now use with your direct reports?
Yeah, that's a good one. Typically try like I said, SBI method, so situation, behavior, and impact. I find that's usually the most useful. At least it forces like the concrete example. I do know that especially if that feedback is behavioral, it is most difficult. Um, but definitely having that example in the moment, providing that feedback, thinking through like what the impact is, the impact part of SBI is the biggest piece that I find the most helpful because that would have hit home a lot harder for me to have actually put forward something much more actionable.
When you think about Nate, once he gets more into the realm of leadership and sits with Coach Beard and Ted in the office, helps them strategize through the next games, etc., you start to see this toxic, unhealthy behavior. If you were Ted Lasso, what feedback would you have given Nate to avoid this whole sidetracking of his development?
Hmm. Well, Kirsten, the way I see it is if somebody is putting forward toxic behavior, like, yes, the SBI method does work really well here, but also we need to be direct. So when we think about Kim Scott and radical candor, like something that I think is incredibly important and why rapport building is incredibly important is if you don't have that rapport and relationship with the individual, you don't have that psychological safety. So that means that if you provide feedback, it can actually be viewed in the wrong way. So what I mean by that is either it is misinterpreted because you don't have that shared understanding, or it can come off as perhaps the feedback being very aggressive. But we do need to be direct when we think about Nate and his growth and how Ted didn't provide the coaching early enough. And it's an uncomfortable conversation to have. And I think that's where, like all of us, I have also been in that situation myself. I did actually very similarly have a member on my team that was getting quite toxic in their behavior because they were constantly disgruntled. They hated their job, truly, truly hated their job. We did have a few high level, light conversations to try to figure out what was going on. But this was also an individual I could not build rapport with because they would shut down every time. Eventually, it did come to a point where we did have a very direct conversation. But the important part is really that rapport building is important. Once you have that relationship, you can then be more direct with that individual. If I was Ted, Ted had a decent relationship with Nate, but he didn't really build that rapport full circle until close to the end when things were too late. But early on in the early stages, the ideal would have been if Ted had taken Nate back, pulled him aside, told him really like, why are you being an asshole? Essentially trying to figure out what was going on. Because the other thing that we have to remember is that we are humans. And if somebody is not necessarily bringing their best self, it could be something externally happening in their day-to-day life. And that's important to figure out.
Especially because Ted says in episode 3, I love coaching because I want these young men to be the best versions of themselves on and off the field. And yet he fails to deliver the same kind of coaching to Nate and help Nate to be the best version of himself. So that was a really interesting leadership failure to observe. Wrapping up, if you were to think about good advice to give introverted leaders or leaders that are different, what would that be?
I would say figure out what your strengths are and amplify them. I think that's applicable to really any leader across the board. Some leaders are really great at being the face of their team. So they're the Ted Lasso, right, of the group. Some members, very much like Beard, are very good at strategizing, figuring out, how from the sidelines, looking at data, figuring out, what those pieces are. But also as a leader, regardless of where your strengths are, like know your strengths, but know your weaknesses. And that's the individual you want. So you want your Nate in your corner because Nate is what would be, anything that you're less strong in. It's not necessarily your strength. I believe that leaders should amplify the strengths within the individuals on their team. So if you have your Nates, certainly bring them into the spotlight and amplify those, but also you go into the room feeling confident because you know what your strengths are.
Thank you so much, Karen. It was a pleasure having you here. Hearing your insights, it inspires me to rethink how I look at leadership and give more space and room to the ones that are not like Ted Lasso, but more like Coach Beard or Nate. So thank you again for being here.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kirsten. Really enjoyed my time. Loved our conversation.
Thank you for tuning in today. Please like us, subscribe, and share. You can also follow Karen Lam on LinkedIn. Just find her with her handle Karen K. Lam. And if you want to learn more about what I do, follow me on Instagram, LinkedIn, or on YouTube under kirsten.penalosa.